ba't ako mag-guest sa katulad kong channel? And then, ano naman? Ikaw talaga itong mga to. Gumagawa kayo ng charot. Hindi, ang gusto ko sana collabs tayo. Parang katulad ng ano. Uh, yun. Alright, collabs is the best. Alright. Welcome back everyone. Maraming salamat. Na-live na pala tayo. Muntik na ako naman, mga Justice Carpet style. May nag-eechosera ng mga tao. Bakit naman kayo ganun? Ako naman sabi ko, love na love natin parati magkaroon ng collaboration dun sa mga like-minded progressives and thinkers and bloggers and all that. Malaki ang pasasalamat ko na, after all of those years na puro mga kaewanan, mga ka-DDS, mga ganun lang, tsaka yung mga pro-Marcos, mga fake news peddlers, mga ganun, nagdo-dominate ng information space on social media. Tuwan-tuwa tayo ngayon na here we are. We have a whole, um, kumbaga catalog ng mga napakagaling na mga vloggers. At of course, kahapon lang we had, again, with Kristan, with Mark. Unfortunately, Attorney Jez was not able to join us. Tomorrow naman, of course, speaking of collaboration, watch out yung latest episode naman natin. With due respect, ito yung mga kasama natin sa Pinas Foundation. Ito ay isang maliit na grupo na ginawa namin, kasama sila Attorney Dino, sila Prof. Cleve, Dr. Robin Garcia, si Bossing Carlo Flores, and then of course we have sila Prof. Ranjit, mga Dean Gary, Dean Ederson. So it's a small effort by us, yung mga medyo activist thinker type people or public intellectual type or advocates, public policy advocate, to put things together. At of course, yung with due respect ay isang maliit na platform, although hindi ganun kaliit dahil of course it's the ZMM, and of course it's led by no less than really the fantastic people well, formerly ABS-CBN, separate na ata sila, no? So we have really fantastic people also overlooking it, like si Boss Zandro. So thank you so much again sa lahat ng mga sumuporta. Again, we're really doing our best here with limited resources. Tingnan nyo nga yung picture na pinost namin kanina nila, diba? Nila Attorney Dino and sila Prof. Cleveland, diba? I mean, you could see talaga, medyo, we're making the most out of the space and little humble resources we have. So talagang kudos sa kanila, and I'm extremely grateful to be part of that group. As I said, the name of the game is collaboration. Kaya throughout the week, kung nakita nyo guys, meron tayong collaborations with not only yung mga quadcoms natin, not only in R&R, not only of course yung discussion natin with sila Attorney Conti, with Justice Carpio, mga other things. This is constantly what we're trying to do, team up with other people. Nevertheless, sabi ko naman today, medyo as we end another week, another hectic week, sabi ko, let me share also my 2 cents on what I feel is the lay of the land. Ano yung mga kailangan natin gawin moving forward, at ano yung mga concerns ko, no? I think nowadays, yung ating mga kaibigan ng progresibo na galit sa korupsyon, yung ating mga kaibigan na who have had enough, who want a better Philippines, more progressive Philippines, malinis na gobyerno, maayos na gobyerno, I'm really happy to see them so inspired. And of course, the other day lang, we had this major event, by the Liberal Party, kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap, no? Which I think is very timely, is very important, because dito nakikita natin na may laban pa rin yung agenda, and I mean agenda in a good way, no? Yung agenda ng good governance ng mga ating mga kaibigan from center, left, and other kinds of persuasions. But actually, marami din tayong alam na kaibigan na medyo conservative on the right side, but still sila rin galit sila sa corruption, because they can see what an evil corruption is, no? And what kind of really corrosive impact it could have on our institution. So I think it was never a debate, whether ikaw ay may pananampalataya at naniwala ka na itong mga corrupt na tao, despite all of the easy money they're enjoying nowadays, talagang may impyerno talaga sila. They will have their day in the afterlife. But even if wala kang pananampalataya, I mean, you could still see, 'di ba? Yung bawat mamahalin na bakasyon na ginagawa, bawat junket na ginagawa ng mga corrupt na politiko, Ang ibig sabihin niyan, libo-libo sa ating mga kababayan na nawala ng oportunidad para magkaroon ng ah, maayos na edukasyon, healthcare of course. Imagine siguro yung isang junket gastos lang ng mga kurakot, uh, $200,000, $300,000, no? And that amount, that could be life-saving. Pagdating sa operasyon, kondisyon, or even basic healthcare ng marami sa ating mga kababayan. So it's really instinctive, no? It's very visceral, almost commonsensical na ang corruption talaga yung masama dahil of course not only from a moral standpoint, dahil maduming pera yan eh. Maduming pera yan. Kaya hindi ko naiintindihan yung mga kurakot. Parang hindi nyo ba alam, at some point it's gonna catch up with you, di ba? If not with you, next generation. Kung yung mga anak mo ay lumaki sa korupsyon, sa maduming pera, there's gonna be something, di ba? There's gonna be something. Now, having said that, to be honest, I'm also quite disappointed because, guys, I'm all for, calling out corruption. I am also 100% for calling out, inconsistencies and hypocrisies. Wala naman perfecto sa atin lahat, tama yan. Pero hindi naman pwede yung, ano ka, ganyan, ganyan, ganyan ka nung isang araw lang, go, go, go ka lang ng ganyan, kahit alam mo naman napaka-corrupt na mamamatay tao, kung ano ng kalokohan ginagawa, nagkakautaw pa sa West Philippines, tapos next thing biglang ngayon, bigla, namulat ka na, galit ka na sa corruption, nakakaya naman nangyari. Ay, hindi pwede yan sa akin. You call that out. But I just got to know, of course, about the tragic situation with Kuya Kim yun, di ba? Kuya Kim's. So, I think this is also a good reminder na, katulad ng sinasabi ko, it is good to call out nonsense. But please lang, wag naman yung cruel type na, di ba? You're driving people into, lalong-lalo na guys, hindi nepo kid. I mean, in a strict sense of the word, hindi nepokit kung anak ka lang ng mga successful na tao na naging successful lang dahil magaling sa kanilang profession, whether doctor, whether artista, whether, I don't know, architect, tech titans. Grabe naman ang mga tao, di ba, guys? So, nakakalungkot naman when I got to know the news about, someone who was driven to extreme depression and then worse dahil sa online harassment and bullying. As someone who has been online harassed and bullied, well, mahirap akong bulliin naman. I think by now it's pretty clear mahirap tayo bullied. But someone has been attacked by trolls and all of that for past 10 years basically, since 2015, since yung mga first social media posts natin. Kasi yung mga tao kasi hindi nila tinitingnan yung kabuuan ng ating interventions. Like, I'm active on so many fronts at once. It's not just a TV interview. It's not just a blog. It's a social media post. It's the articles and the columns. It's the books. It's all of those things. Pag nilagay mo lahat mo yan, my goodness, I've run out of how many attacks and trolling and all I've got throughout the past decade. And of course, para sa akin naman, kung wala kang choice, you just have to strengthen up, diba? You have to go. But having said that, not everyone can process online attacks in the same way. I mean, for some of us, I entered into it in my late 20s, mga ganun. Parang kumaga, mid to late 20s, parang kumaga, okay, siguro nagkaroon ako ng sapat na life experience and sapat na exposure to say, baka ito na talaga, ito na talagang, ayan, speaking of mga online trolls, ayan, mga tabad na naman. Sabi ko siguro ito na talagang vocation natin, so let's go. And I'm extremely grateful for the kind of education I got in, not only the best universities in the world, but also from the best parents I could ask for, from supportive family, friends, my mentors, and others, all of these people who imparted the right values to us. So kaya I was able to get through it. But let's be clear, not everyone, guys, can process online harassment. Kasi hindi naintindihan ng tao eh. Iba yung inatak ka ng ibang tao na paisa-isa lang. Kunyari may kaaway ka online. May masamang tao kung ano. Iba yung sabay-sabay sila umatak sa'yo. Talagang hate train, kumbaga, 'di ba? And nakakalungkot din. Parang ngayon, inatak kahit sino na lang na successful yung parents at medyo magarang or maayos or medyo komportable ang buhay. Hindi naman ganun, guys. Ang kina-call out dapat. Pero at the same time, of course, wag naman yung sobrang bullying na kawawa. Yung mga tao na fina-flaunt yung pera na alam naman natin ay galing sa mga ghost projects, flood control projects, galing sa nakaw basically. Alam naman natin yan eh. Pero wag naman sana kahit sino na lang na anak ng successful na tao, atakin nyo. Grabe naman yun, guys. Baka naman ano na yun, inggit na lang yan tapos yung weaponize yan. Huwag ganun. That's wrong. That's wrong. And as I said, you know, honestly, kahit binubuli ko rin yung mga trolls natin and ano, at the end of the day, alam mo, kahit sino ka, kahit supporter ka ni ganitong presidente, ako, I'm willing to talk to anyone, you know? Uh, Precisely because, guys, at the end of the day, we have to live together. We have to live next to each other. At the end of the day, with few exceptions, lahat naman tayo, we want the best for our country. So we have to really work it out. Now, having said that, I'm still gonna call out nonsense. Pero may timing, may platform, may etc. Kaya kagabi rin, medyo na-stress ako when I watched yung isang apo ni Manuel Quezon was like going all out attack kila Jericho Rosales. I mean, I don't know, sino ba naman ako? Ako naman, ang take ko lang naman dyan is sana naman kinausap yung pamilya. Kinuha yung kanilang perspective bago magkaroon ng yung pelikula na yan. Kasi parang feeling ko ang nangyari kasi dyan, parang hindi kinuha yung perspective nila eh. Wala naman problema na at the end of the day, bilang director or writer, you push for a particular narrative. Okay lang naman yan. Pero siguro due diligence lang na sana kausapin mo rin yung mga people na may memory, may direct memory sa isang bagay. So nakita mo talaga ng feeling nila na alienate sila or parang nabastusan sila. But it was still also sad to see na naging ganyan na medyo again, tama rin naman si Jericho Rosales na there's a proper platform for things. Pero ang problema kasi sa sobrang na-alienate yung family siguro, napuno na sila, di ba? They had to make that kind of interventions. I don't know. Hintayin na lang natin si Manuel Quezon, the third, di ba? Ano rin yan, di ba? So probably can also say a thing or two about the Quezon family and all of that. Now, having said that, guys, balikan natin ito. So, isang araw, General Torre ay nagpakita doon sa event ng Liberal Party kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap, no? And of course, you know also General Torre is meron siyang ino-organized na event na against bullying. Oh, speaking of against bullying, 'di ba? Si General Torre meron din siyang takbo para against bullying. It's interesting. I'm honestly still wondering what is the strategy of General Torre because he will have to retire and within a month or so. I think mukhang nangyari dito is he's just gonna run the clock, no? Until maging effectively magre-retire na siya. As a four-star general, he still remains as a four-star general in the Philippine National Police. Siguro they just found na lang a kind of compromise na lang, no? Na they will just run the clock na lang for him to retire as a four-star general police and get all the benefits, recognitions, and respect that he deserves accordingly. Having said that, I think it's interesting that he attended itong event ng Liberal Party. Well, pag tinanong mo naman si General Torres, sabi naman niya, wala naman pahintulot na political relevance. Sabi niya, first of all, I cannot be a member of any political party because I'm an active police officer still, although maybe not in a few months. So we're clear on that. I was invited by friends. I was able to help them when cyclone struck Masbate. Their barangay was one of the hard-hit areas. So we'll have proceeds from our foundation. They staged a fundraising event. I went to help them there in Masbate, and she invited me. She said, hey, we have an event about having no poor Filipinos if there's no poor corruption, kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap, no poverty if there's no corruption, and anti-corruption event. I said, I will attend and watch. No problem yan. Sabi naman niya, I think the fight against corruption should transcend political lines. That fight should not be mixed with or defined by politics because every Filipino is affected. First of all, corruption is against the law. So, kung ano man ang kulay mo, 'di ba? Kung anong paniniwala mo sa buhay, ay dapat we should have one goal which is fighting corruption, etc. No. So anyway, so basically piniplay down niya yan, but I think the messaging is quite clear, 'di ba? The messaging is quite clear that General Torre, as he got eased out of the Marcos administration, is getting eased out of the Marcos administration. Mukhang the center of gravity to him naturally, because he stands for accountability, because siya yung kalaban ng mga Dutertes for helping to can not one but two major figures. Sorry, not can. I mean, you know what I mean. Like handover for detention. Not one but two major figures within the pro Duterte camp. I think it's natural that really his best options here right now is build his own momentum, but build some sort of a tactical alliance with the progressives, liberals, among others. It's tricky. It's not gonna be easy, but I think in many ways sobrang natural sa kanya dahil nga kung maalala ni guys nung time na PNP chief siya full-fledged, let's just call it that way. Um, pumunta siya sa Commission on Human Rights, which was quite unprecedented, at ni-remind niya lahat na, ang boss nila ay Commission on Human Rights when it comes to matters of um, good governance and karapatan pang tao. So this is a very interesting thing, no? That we're looking at right now. Um, Again, you could say this cuts both ways. Sa isang banda, malayo pang 2028, and I think General Torre has every reason to look at prospects for running in 2028, at the very least as a senador. Um, I know maraming tao ay naalala na when I was saying that he could still be something even more than that. Let's see. Right now, obviously, the momentum is not as much there, but I think if he plays his cards well, he could be part of a kind of a united, parang good Philippines, kind of progressive, anti-corruption kind of slate, diba? You can imagine Chel Jokno running for Senate in 2020, and you can imagine um, uh, Leila de Lima probably also running for Senate again. Other people are saying na better for Leila even to go for something higher because after all, yung kanyang credentials as someone who sacrificed a lot for freedom of democracy and standing up to the Dutertes, I mean, sila ni Sentry ay talagang walang laban dyan eh. No one comes close to them. Um, so you could say that naturally, yun yung pinakamalapit um, na center of gravity, political center of gravity. So it's not about political party, it's about coalition, right? Now, I still don't know about dynamics between General Torre and President Marcos. Obviously, it used to be very good, but now maybe it's trickier. But who knows? I mean, you could imagine really a kind of a grand coalition later on kung saan pwede magsama sila General Torre, pwede magsama yung mga top leaders ng progressive liberal opposition, pero pwede rin whether may tacit or meron direct or somewhere in between na grand coalition also with the administration. Because at the end of the day, ang problema kasi ni Marcos is he will not have endorsing power. Absolutely. Baka negative pa nga yung maging endorsing power niya. I mean, pati nga si Pinoy who went down with like 50-55% approval rating had a negative endorsement effect on Mar Rojas. So yun, wala yan. But, having said that, Marcos also, wala rin siyang wala rin siyang contender na competitive, at least not yet, unless he might want to I don't know, support siguro isang Tulfo. Is it gonna be Rafi, Erwin? I don't know. One of the Remulla brothers wants to run. I don't know. So I think you could see the contours of an arrangement kung saan Marcos supports a candidate that is both palatable to the progressive and liberals and also enough of anti-Duterte or parang enough of political conviction to stand up to the Dutertes and hold them accountable, right? Or stand against whoever is going to be the standard bearer of the Duterte. So you could imagine a grand coalition whereby still General Torre will be there, but also some progressives and liberals, and potentially also either tacitly or indirectly some sort of tactical alliance with the administration. Because at the end of the day, the administration will have the resources. Sila pa rin, they will oversee the elections, the organization of the elections, among other things. So let's see that. Again, it's going to be very tricky. Again, debatable yan. Probably it's going to be harder if it's Lenny. Probably easier if it's Brisa or I don't know, maybe even Kiko, I would say. Of course, the other day lang nagkaroon ng meeting between Kiko and President Marcos, and 1 hour long meeting on a specific issue of advocacy na mahalaga para kay Kiko at saka good governance and better democracy sa atin, and that was very successful. So you could see permutations kung saan mag-work yan eh. These groups can come together and can make this work. So it's very interesting. But as I said, it's going to be a tall order for General Torre because alam naman natin, 2020 is so far away and madali mag-move on ng mga tao. So the challenge for him is how to keep this momentum. And I think as long as he's part of a group of good people, people who stand for good governance, people who stand for anything that is increasingly more important sa ating mga kababayan, 'di ba? Um, I think that would be something that that fits yung kanyang branding because hindi lang siya matapang, he also stands for good governance in the case of General Torre, but also something that could politically make sense. Kasi lahat naman sila kalaban talaga mga Duterte. So none of them want the Dutertes to come back for obvious reasons. Not only aside from the fact that they see the Dutertes as really against the very principles of our constitution, but also because alam na natin, di ba, the retribution that would come if the Dutertes come back. So things are gonna get trickier, and the challenge here is to maintain momentum and make this work. Um, maybe down the road, Gerald Torre could also talk about his experience about fighting corruption, about good governance. I mean, you have another former top executive from PNP, his fellow CIDG head, former General Magalong, Mayor Magalong, also taking up that mantle. Also, if you look at Lacson, uh, former PNP chief Lacson, he also took up the mantle of fighting against corruption. We can have a debate about who's like really fully sincere, blah blah. Ibang usapan yan. But in terms of branding, in terms of positioning, Magalong did it, Lacson did it. Why not in the case of General Torre? And General Torre has every reason to still be in the mix and keep on going. And there may perfect siyang overlap also with yung advocacy ng mga pinks and progressives and mga others. Yes, walang kulay ang demokrasya. Yes, dapat ang ating laban sa korupsyon ay base sa ating pagmamahal sa bayan. At the same time, alam naman natin may team kadiliman at team kasamaan. So when I say pink progressive, basically ito yung hindi team kasamaan at team kadiliman. Yun na lang. Lagay na lang natin in that category, neither nor. Okay, now let's really go to the meat of the discussion today because bumabalik ulit itong kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap. As I said, and uulitin ko for the millionth time, baka na naman iti-twist na naman kung sino-sino dyan. Yan ang problema sa atin eh. 'Di ba? Talagang kung may sasabihin ka na hindi tugma sa agenda or gusto ng ibang tao, i-twist nila. So, ito, gusto niyan ganito kasi ganito. No, no, no. 100% talagang maimpyerno ka kung kurakot kang tao. 100%. I'm sure that. Kung meron kang pananampalataya, maniwala ka. 100% corruption has immensely corrosive effect. Gamitin mo lang utak mo, you can see what it means. Like corruption means resources taken away from public project, from government projects, etc., and put in something na frivolous or worse, right? Now, having said all of those things, guys, I think it's also important to have an intelligent, informed discussion on this issue, right? So again, we had a long conversation on this before, I know pa. So I suppose guys can go back to that and balikan yung discussion yan. But so as you can see dun sa graph na pinipost ko dito, don't worry dun sa mga ibang kababayan natin, kaibigan natin, ipopost natin din dito. As you can see in the graphs here, when it comes to corruption, and this is the latest ranking of the Philippines. Of course, our lowest rankings were during the time of transition from ERAP to Arroyo, early 2000s. And then nag-low na naman tayo in terms of our corruption rankings nung time ni Duterte, di ba? So things are not obviously good now with all of this corruption scandal. I think, things could even look worse for the Philippines in terms of rankings. But, this kind of corruption rankings are obviously based on perception. But these are informed perception by business sector, by civil society groups, by experts. Syempre, corruption yan. So, ano yan? Off the books yan, di ba? So, there's always gonna be more perception-based approach to this because kung you can find evidence of all sorts of corruption and etc., then may clear legal implication. Ibang usapan na yan. Prosecution na yan, di ba? Hindi naman Department of Justice, Global Department of Justice ang itong mga rankings na yan. But I think these rankings make sense on a lot of levels. So you can clearly see the least corrupt countries in these rankings are Scandinavian countries, and anyone who has even a basic familiarity with Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, etc. knows sobrang baba yung corruption sa mga countries na yan, almost negligible. We can also see doon sa map na yan, the darker blue color, that means less corrupt. Kung makikita nyo, practically all of the developed countries and wealthy countries in the world, sila yung pinaka-dark blue, meaning sila yung pinaka-mababa yung corruption rate, right? So, you can clearly, if you want to play the correlational game, you can see that kung mas mayaman ng isang bansa, usually mas mababa ang corruption, right? So actually, you can make the correlational argument in the other direction. You could say, 'di ba? Kung walang mahirap, wala rin masyadong corruption because again, you look at it, the wealthiest countries in the world, sila rin also have one of the lowest corruption rates, right? This is absolutely clear. Huwag kayong magulo dyan sa TikTok. Ano naman, Coco, ano na host kayo dyan. Anyways, go back to this. So actually, if you look at it from a very even simplistic correlational standpoint, kung walang mahirap, walang corrupt, or kung konti lang kahirapan, konti rin ang corruption. Again, you can see in this map, diba? This is the CPI. So here, palakayin natin. So you can see the wealthiest country in the world, sila rin ang pinakamababang corruption rate, right? So, what's going on here? Interestingly, there's another graph I'm showing there. If you look at the Philippines, and this is where the correlation that walang corrupt, walang mahirap, again comes a little bit under question because sa isang banda naman, kung titignan mo, Philippines corruption ranking is almost identical to Turkey, Thailand, Brazil, and then of course you have other countries, Bosnia, Mongolia, Panama, etc. So, yes, our ranking is really bad. At the same time, if you look at these countries, sobrang diverse yung kanilang levels of development. So if, for instance, you look at Turkey, which is also, their score is almost identical. We're 33, we're 34 out of 100. Turkey and Thailand have a per capita income twice higher than the Philippines. Both are highly industrialized countries outside the West. They're still developing emerging markets. Both are also upper middle income. In fact, in the case of Brazil, it's the same thing except writ large. So if you look at the case of Brazil, so in the case of Brazil, which has almost identical also corruption rankings as the Philippines, in the case of Brazil, they have one of the biggest economies in the world outside the West, kaya nga BRICS, Brazil. They have also one of the largest manufacturing sector, and their per capita income is also twice that of the Philippines. So you have Brazil, Turkey, and Thailand having almost exact corruption perception and corruption ranking as the Philippines, but very, very different economic profile. Very, very different levels of economic development, right? Upper middle income, some of them are moving towards, in fact, Turkey is moving towards high income already, right? Thailand medyo nag-stagnate recently. So what I'm saying here is that you can run the correlation argument in many ways. You can also say kung walang mahirap, walang corrupt dahil pinakamayaman ng bansa tend to have, meaning not 100% of the case. But you go Singapore, you go Scandinavia, you go Canada, you go Western Europe, they have one of the lowest corruption rates. You go Australia, you go New Zealand, right? And then if you read that history of these countries, lahat ng mga countries na yan, they had massive corruption at some point in history. US is slightly lower because, of course, long story, but alam nyo na. But even the US, if you look at the history of US, extremely corrupt country, way into the 20th century, massive corruption. President Garfield got assassinated because someone didn't get the kind of a diplomatic position he wanted, blah, blah. You can look at the case of, you can watch all of Boardwalk Empire, Gangs of New York. But you think like Western Europe was not corrupt 50, 100 years ago when they were at our level of economic development. If you look at the GDP per capita of France in the early 19th century, during I think this is the Third Republic, they had almost the same per capita income as the Philippines. So around 100 years ago, when they were at our level of development, corruption was also extremely high. So you can easily say, guys, na the argument is actually the other way. Kung pag yumaman ng bansa mo, lalong bababa, right? Lalong bababa yung levels of corruption. And again, the logic is very clear, right? The logic is very clear. Habang yumayaman ng isang bansa, lumalaki yung middle class. Habang lumalaki yung middle class, 'di ba? Dumadaming tao na pwede maging active sa politika at lumaban sa corruption. Habang dumadami ang middle class, habang dumadami mas mahirap magkaroon ng vote buying, right? Kung habang yumayaman ng bansa, habang tumataas yung sahod, yung sweldo, mas mahirap magkaroon ng bribery or corruption. Habang nagde-develop ng country, tumataas ang income levels, nagkakaroon ng more political consciousness, political awareness, magiging mas magpalaban ng tao, hindi na sila depende sa mga politiko for their basic needs. You can see, right? You can go on and on. So the logic also works in that way, right? So what am I saying here is this. don't make just simplistic correlation argument, because this graph just shows you kung walang mahirap, walang corrupt. Or the more na mayaman ng isang bansa, the mas mababa yung corruption. And at the same time, you also have another graph here which shows Philippines, Brazil, Turkey, Thailand, almost exact levels of corruption based on this index. This is the most comprehensive index we can have, authoritative index, and at very, very different levels of economic development, nevertheless. So in short, what we're saying here, guys, is other factors matter. And I would say other factors that matter, and probably even matter more in terms of fighting. So you have to fight corruption. 100% you have to fight corruption. It's an evil, no question about it. If you want to make a country more developed, however, you have to look at other factors too. In fact, other factors could be more important. So why is Thailand and Turkey and Brazil? Why are these countries? They have lower levels of poverty as a share of their overall population. Bakit itong mga bansa na to, they have had more sustained economic growth throughout the years? Bakit itong mga bansa na to, especially in the case of Turkey, I would say, and even Thailand to a certain degree, why the levels of income inequality is not as bad as, let's say, in the Philippines. So dyan papasok ng ibang explanations, right? And of course, some of the explanations you can look at is, of course, economic policy, right? We can talk about also legislation, for instance, party building, for instance, strengthening their ombudsman, strengthening their judicial institutions. Yes, common sense yan, given na yan. But I would say, if you really want to fight poverty, yes, you fight against corruption, but you also fight against bad policies, right, that create poverty, that feed off on or actually exacerbate the corruption problem, right? This is what the Harvard economist Danny Roderick, who's originally from Turkey, and like Daron Acemoglu, also two of them are among the top development economists in the world right now. His argument is that what you need is manufacturing sector. If you have the right policies, you bring in the right quality of investments, you bring in the manufacturing investments, right? You create better jobs with economies of scale, more people will benefit, larger middle class, more push for good governance, more reforms in the state institutions. You create those, what you call, virtuous cycles. So for instance, I mean, again, this is very easy to understand. If you want to understand, isa sa mga dahilan na our economy has not been as inclusive in terms of development, you could see also the impact that our policies have had on our manufacturing sector, right? So alam natin, for instance, this is the best known. Think of the case of Marikina, right? So Marikina, it had really one of a world-class shoe industry. So imagine ilan sa ating mga kababayan, libo-libo sa ating mga kababayan na meron silang trabaho sa shoe industry na yan. In fact, it was an export-oriented shoe industry, world-class, high quality. Kumbaga, we had almost like our own little Lombardy here in the Philippines, right? But the moment we open up our markets to Chinese imports or import from other countries, at alam natin, that was never fair game. Because sa ibang bansa, they have subsidies. Yes, they can remove some of the official subsidies kasi bawal yan under World Trade Organization. But we know that there are a lot of implicit subsidies. For instance, subsidized land, subsidized electricity, subsidized education dun sa workforce mo. In that sense, it was never a fair competition. Kaya the moment na binuksan natin yung ating ekonomiya, binaba natin yung tariffs natin without any industrial policy, without any smart trade policy, wala tayong laban. Because China could build things on a far larger scale, and then they could make it artificially even cheaper by not only repressing yung labor cost, but also subsidizing electricity. Napakamahal ang electricity sa Pilipinas, hindi siya subsidized. Sa China, sa ibang bansa, napaka-subsidized. Land is subsidized. They get tax breaks. They get all sorts of different mechanism support to create high human capital level but low labor costs. So wala tayong laban nun. So that's why the moment we open up our economy to international trade from countries who had all of those advantages and were really cheating around, and it's unfair to just look at China. Everyone has been doing that. And then ikaw lang yung parang syunga na wala kang ginawa, wala tayong support sa Marikina. Were we subsidizing? Were we supporting Marikina business? What are the major policy for our state to support our Marikina shoe industry? Right? Anong ginawa ng ating, Department of Tourism, whatever. Like, we have done nothing close to what other countries are doing. Right? In terms of national branding, in terms of promotion of our products, in terms of industrial policy, wala tayong laban. Guess what? The moment we open up our economy, Boom, pasok ang imports. In fact, there's something called dumping. Literally, it means what you feel it is, which is, meron kang overproduction, sabi natin sa country X, napakamura, idadump mo lang sa ibang bansa, one-tenth the price. Kasi ayaw mo nang mapuno yung storage houses mo. Yung mga nagsishopee-shopee dyan, alam niyan, minsan, sobrang mura yung mga nasa Shopee dahil they're just trying to get rid of their gusto nila lang ano yung storage nila. Kasi mahal yung storage facilities and all of that. So, dumping ang tawag dyan. So, you just dump it on other countries, one-tenth of the price. How are you going to compete with that? Look at stuff, the price of stuff on Shopee. How are you going to compete with that? Right? So, bad economic policies create massive poverty. And my contention, and I'm drawing on a whole literature, including from my mentor si Walden Bell, but so many studies show na isa sa mga dahilan na napakataas ang poverty sa atin is because of also bad economic policies. We never had the strong industrial policy to build our manufacturing sector and attract high-quality investments from abroad. We didn't subsidize our electricity. We didn't create the right conditions for it. So, actually, if you talk to the top businesses and yung corruption, given na sa kanila. Again, look at the ranking of the Philippines in terms of corruption. It's not that different from Turkey and Thailand. And yet, Turkey and Thailand and Brazil and now Vietnam, which also has similar score to us, slightly better, they're getting all of those investments not because they're like haven of good governance. They're not Sweden. They're not Norway, right? They're getting that because of all these other factors I was mentioning, right? Yung presyo ng utility costs, right? Yung quality of human capital, right? And then you had this really active effort by their national government to get this kind of high quality investments, right? So again, this is it. So if you look at FDI stock of Turkey, Brazil, Thailand. Brazil kasi ang laking bansa eh. But Turkey and Thailand have actually smaller population than us. If you look at these countries, they're getting those investments not because they're not corrupt. Hello, their level of corruption is similar to us. But they're getting it because of the other good economic policies they had. And that's why they were able to bring down poverty, significantly create sustainable job, and increasingly even world-class industries of their own. Here in Europe, you can find a lot of products na good price, hindi made in China. They're made in Turkey, right? So again, so look at all of this. Again, of course, masamang corruption given yan. But if you want to understand economic development and poverty alleviation, there are many other factors that come into play. And some of these factors are even more important. Like a bad economic policy or not having a good economic policy can create even more corruption. I'm sorry, indirectly, but it can create even more poverty, right? Anyway, it can also create more corruption because, if there's maldevelopment, there's massive inequality, there's concentration of wealth, you're also creating the conditions for dynasties, oligarchies, blah, 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 right? And in fact, we know that in countries that move towards more and more manufacturing, particularly in the case of Turkey, I would say the so-called Anatolian tigers, so if you go to the certain regions of Anatolia where a lot of Zara products are made, a lot of electronics products are made, there you created a whole new middle class. In fact, you created a new merchant class which became very, very influential also in shaping Turkish politics. So suddenly, meron kang isang empowered new constituency, right? Na hindi na umaasa sa mga dating oligarchs, right? Because, Turkey, Thailand, Philippines, lahat naman tayo may mga oligarchs tayo, di ba? But because of shift to manufacturing export-oriented industry, you created this whole new class of SMEs and increasingly larger than SMEs who also have political influence. And then on and on and on. Do you get what I'm saying here? Anyway, I don't want to make this a big lecture about economic development policy, etc. Ang sinasabi ko lang sa inyo is that let's not fall for simplistic explanations. And yes, we have to have a strong moral stance against corruption 100%, but we also have to have a strong stance against bad economic policies or absence of good economic policies, which are costing us even more in terms of poverty and in terms of foregone opportunities and in terms of not getting the right investments and technology and inputs to make the country a better place. Yun yung sinasabi natin. So in many ways, guys, our problem is simple. We need to, well, it's not simple, mahirap siya, but the solution is straightforward. You not only fight against corruption 100%, right, but you also have to fight against bad economic policies. That's really the story here, right? So if you look at it, the richest countries in the world tend to have the lowest poverty rate. So the logic is very simple. The more wealthy you become, uh, the stronger institutions, the stronger middle class, the stronger the scrutiny, the better the media scrutiny, etc. So that's why corruption tends to be lowest in highest, most developed countries. But again, that's just correlational in the same way that you can run it in another way. But precisely because when you look at the numbers of Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, Brazil, similar levels of corruption, but very different levels of economic development. Practically all those three countries are twice richer than us in per capita income. And they have far better, more diversified economies than us. So if we have same level of corruption, but different economic development trajectory, then logically that means there are other factors that explain that divergence. Because if it's a direct causation, then if the Philippines, Thailand, and Brazil, per the data, have similar level, they also have to have similar level of economic development, but they don't. So that means there's another factor that influences it, right? Common sense, right? Actually, it's not common sense, unfortunately. You have to properly study it. But you get what I'm saying. So the challenge for us is to keep on improving our economy, fighting against corruption, fighting against vote buying, and also fighting against concentration of power in the hands of few oligarchs and political dynasties. And that's where we can get the Philippines in the right direction. Gets nyo ba? Inuulit-ulit ko yan kasi mamaya naman isa-splice na naman yung mga walang yung ano man. But you get what I'm saying. Fight against corruption, but also fight against bad economic policies or fight for good economic policies that can give us twice the income levels we have right now. Because there are countries out there like Brazil and Turkey and and Thailand, which have almost the same level of corruption, but they're twice richer than us. So they're doing other things right, and there are other factors that explain why they're economically more prosperous than us. All right. On that note, thank you very much, guys. Maraming salamat. I know this is complicated. There are many moving parts here. We can have a long debate about this, but I think what we definitely should do is to go beyond simplistic kind of slogans and all. Yes, fight corruption because it's evil, it's bad, but also fight against bad economic policies or absence of good economic policies, which are depriving us of all of those high quality investments and opportunities that could make the Filipino life much, much better, that could bring down the poverty much more effectively, and could put us on the pathway to becoming a high income country and a low corruption country. Right? On that note, thank you very much, guys. Maraming salamat for a fantastic discussion for throughout the week. We had this really long conversation with whole series of different experts and friends. We also uploaded a recent episode we did in partnership with Foreign Affairs Magazine with Jonathan Zinn, who used to lead the China policy of the Biden administration at the National Security Council. Please check that out. So there are lots of different things we're doing. As I said, I don't do one thing, I don't do one style, I do multiple styles at the same time, right? So generally on our podcast, usually we try to be more informal. But there are times like this that we do kind of almost lecture-ish. We're also having, thanks to Foreign Affairs Magazine, among others, also doing this kind of serious, thoughtful, nevertheless still breezy conversation with top experts in the world. Again, no offense to anyone, but I think this is where our platform is unique, not only in the Philippines but in the broader region. But of course, if you want a more serious, thoughtful, formal kind of conversations and interviews, check out nyo naman yung ating The View from Manila, yung interviews natin. Upcoming ones, we have fantastic interviews with Stephen Consonjing. We have fantastic discussion also with Professor Ranjit Rai, and also with Apa Ongpin. So check that out to analyze Philippine politics in economics in conversation with the top experts in the country. You can find a YouTube version of that. It's on One News TV5, but you can find for free yung YouTube version niya on One News on YouTube. All right, maraming salamat. Thank you very much. And of course, don't forget also in previous episode natin on the View from Manila with Dr. Professor Jesus Felipe, who used to lead the Philippine portfolio at the Asian Development Bank and is now a professor at De La Salle University. To also look at the more broader historical perspective, check out also my interview with Dr. Lisandro Claudio of University of California, Berkeley, who also has a fantastic new book on the origins of bad economic policies in the Philippines. On that note, thank you very much. God bless. And please don't forget to follow us on different platforms, particularly TikTok, but also on YouTube and among others. Katulad ng pangako ko, we did some exclusive only for community members in YouTube. So some of the, let's say, highbrow and interesting episodes we just did it live exclusively only for our community members on YouTube. All right. Thank you very much. God bless and talk to you soon. Mm.